Good evening. As usual, we'll start with a brief summary of what's been happening in these chapters so that we know exactly what we're going to be discussing today and won't spoil things by inadvertently revealing what is coming next. So we'll look at the main characters and themes, see how they've progressed, and then I shall explore a few points that interested me and hope you'll find them interesting too. Right. So let me just clear that off the screen and hope you can see the text. Right, so the main plots. Burgo Fitzgerald, having lain dormant all this time, acts to stir things up. He's heard that Lady Glencora is not happy in her marriage, and he decides that eloping with him will solve everything. He suggests they run away when the Pallisers visit his uncle and aunt, Sir and Lady Monk, after Christmas. And to cover the expenses, he borrows £150 from a loan shark, with George Vavasor backing the bill. Now, Lady Glencora, extremely distressed and extremely confused, appeals to her husband to be excused from visiting, but she's told to pull herself together. She confides in Alice during a nocturnal walk in the Priory ruins. And aided by the elements and Miss Iphigenia Palliser, Alice succeeds in averting possible disaster. Lady Glencora catches a timely illness owing to a nocturnal walk, which necessitates her returning to Matching after Christmas at Gatherum Castle. Burgo is mightily put out at her absence, vents his annoyance on the assembled guests, much to Lady Monk's consternation. But Plantagenet, of course, oblivious to everything, manages to get Sir Cosmo Monk's promise of support for his chancellorship bid, so he's supremely happy. And the other misfortune is that Alice incurs the displeasure of the Palliser clan for allowing Lady Glencora to remain outdoors despite her delicate constitution. Alice has broken off her engagement to John Grey, which he ascribes to that irrational spirit of sadness, which, when overindulged, drives men to madness and self-destruction. He refuses to accept her decision unless and until she marries someone else. Alice, of course, is looking for a purpose in life, or at least a supporting role, such as would be possible with George. But she knows, or thinks she knows, that she does not want to marry him. Both Kate and George Vavasor come to learn of these developments. George's feelings are mixed. There's some affection for Alice, and above all, a wish to steal her from John Grey, and his need for money, obviously. So he writes to her proposing marriage, talks of how they're now older and wiser, and personal love must yield to compatibility of interests and aspirations, and tells her with complete honesty that he wants to use her money to further his ambitions. She too agrees on similar terms, asking for a year's delay, but offering him her money immediately. She tells herself that it'll be a platonic relationship of mutual benefit. But George's visit and attempted show of affection make her realize that she can't stand a physical relationship with him. And then John Grey's visit and his searching questions unsettle her further. She's now regretting the loss of John Grey, engagement to a cousin, and starts to hope that if she gives him 3/4 of her fortune, capital from £300 per annum, and she hopes to raise £8,000, then maybe he'll release her from marriage. If not, she's even contemplating suicide at the end of the year. So we're back to square one, plus the added burden of guilt, regrets, guilt, and shame. Whom will she marry eventually? Can we bear to wait? Oh, yes, very easily indeed. John Grey is informed of Alice's engagement to her cousin. He rushes to London, compares notes with a despondent John Vavasor, suggests that Alice needs to be rescued from herself and from George, of course, even if it costs all her fortune. So he says any demands for money from George to Alice are to be passed on to her father and then to John Gray to be paid through his lawyer. And John Gray insists on regarding Alice's need for a role, her decision to marry her cousin, her whole state of mind as a temporary affliction or illness. Of course, how could he think of anyone actually rejecting for George Vavasor? Anyway, he hopes that once her money is gone and George deserts her, she will come to her senses and marry him. But to be fair, he is determined to save her from George, even at the risk of losing his money. He has an interview with Alice in which he asks her 2 questions. When is the marriage? Not for a year, comes the reply. Why did you accept him? No clear answer. So John Gray is convinced from her manner that she does not love George, puts his plan into action. Her father is not entirely convinced, but agrees. And the first demand for £1,000 is made, duly paid by Mr. Toome, John Gray's lawyer, into George Vavasor's account. Now, John Vavasor has not played a big part in Alice's upbringing through no fault of his own. He shares a house with her, but stays away at his club most of the time. Still, he's horrified now at the prospect of her marriage to her cousin and fears she'll end up penniless. She understandably resents his interference as he's neglected her all these years in London. But he suddenly acquires a sense of responsibility and talks of taking out life insurance so that she won't be destitute when he dies. But strangely enough, he too has reservations about John Gray, regards him as too good, and again says, I don't know how she'll ever put up with him, he said to himself. He's so terribly conceited. Surprise, surprise. I shall never forget how he went on about Charles Kemble and what a fool he made of himself. Right, so, and now, George. Life has been unjustly cruel to George. His grandfather earlier refused to mortgage the estate to enable him to further his wine business, and is insisting on an apology which he has to make to be sure of his inheritance. He has no money, owes his election agent Scrooby £92 from the last election, and has to meet the net costs of the next one in June. So an advance of £600 is needed now. He's managed to persuade Alice to marry him, but she has imposed a delay of a year and is unresponsive to his physical demonstrations of affection. He's annoyed, hurt, but determined to use her money and asks Kate to get it for him. But Kate feels that Alice should be spared till after they're married. Aunt Greenow is approached, but she doesn't feel obliged to help George or keep the Vavasor flag flying. Kate then has to ask Alice, and the money's paid, we saw earlier. And then another trouble, the sudden death of the Marquis of Bunratty, and his son and heir, the present MP for Chelsea, is promoted to the Lords. By-election is called, so he's got to find the money for that immediately, and then a general election a few months later in June, so that's additional expense. George is worried, and he curses his grandfather for staying alive into his 80s, while the Marquis dies at 50. How convenient if it was the other way around. And Mrs. Greenow. I found her a welcome bit of comic relief. The substantial Mr. Cheesacre with solid assets at Oileymeads wants to marry the wealthy Mrs. Greenow before she's spent all her money on her friends, family, and personal frivolities. But he has a rival, the charming but good-for-nothing Captain Belfield. The captain has a way with the ladies and is totally impervious to Cheesacre's insults and his bribes to induce him to give up and leave the coast clear for Cheesacre. Mrs. Greenow is inclined to prefer the captain. After all, she's married for money once and she's got it, so she can now afford to choose romance. Her dinner party is the decider. She's taken down to dinner by the captain because his military rank gives him precedence over Mr. Cheesacre. She divides her attentions equally between the two gentlemen, and all goes well during the dinner. Then they quarrel over port, and there's an exchange of insults follows, and then Captain Belfield gets into the drawing room first and manages to inveigle himself into a cosy sofa with Mrs. Greenow, looking at a photo album. Cheesacre is apoplectic. The captain coolly takes his leave at 7 p.m., retrieves his possessions from Oileymeads, and leaves for the railway station. Mr. Cheesacre tries again to convince the lady to favour him on the strength of his wealth and standing. She turns him away, advising him to speak of love rather than possessions if he wants to succeed with women. He leaves undeterred, determined to profit by the advice and try again the next morning. Arrives home to see the captain leaving. So whom will she marry? Then, finally, a word about the squire. Squire Vavasor is an arch conservative with old-fashioned values, typical of his age and class. He hasn't forgiven Mrs. Greenow for marrying into trade. George offends him by asking him to raise a sum of money from the family estate to advance his wine business. Yet, though the estate is unentailed, he doesn't consider leaving the property away from the legitimate heir, George. He strongly disapproves of Alice's changes of mind and even calls her a jilt. But when he hears John Vavasor's criticism of his grandson, he stands up for George and agrees to forget and forgive if he apologizes. Decides that if Alice marries her cousin, he'll settle the estate on their first son, safe from George. He's also concerned about Kate giving all her money to her brother for his election expenses and fears that she will be left destitute. So how will he dispose of the estate? So that sums up the situation so far. And now I'll just go through a few interesting points and hope you'll find them fun too. Now, George Vavasor and Burgo Fitzgerald, they're presented as the two villains in the piece, but they're quite different characters. Burgo, a feckless idler, ne'er-do-well, but is generally a good-natured, likable person. His looks have survived a lifetime of dissipation, almost like Dorian Gray without the picture. Popular with the family, pleasant to everyone, courteous to ladies, kind to children, his generosity to the vagrant girl in buying her food and drink and a shilling for a bed when she's down and out is consistent with his nature. He is unselfish, cares more for Lady Glencora than her money, and is also totally honest with himself. He doesn't blame anybody but himself for his misfortunes, and he also realizes the seriousness of his crime in eloping with a married woman, but argues that Glencora accepted him first and was forced to marry someone else against her will. So he feels it's only fair that they should be reunited, and it was her marriage that was wrong. And he dreams of a brighter future with Glencora, away from the cigars and drinks and temptation somewhere in Europe. Of course, George Vavasor sneers at that. A life of Juan and heyday with plenty pal coming after you like old Lambro, he sneers. The reference is to a poem by Byron, Don Juan, based on the legend, but Don Juan is portrayed not as a womanizer, but a man easily seduced by women. So the story goes something like this. Don Juan, a teenager, has to flee Spain after an affair with a married woman where she seduces him. After several adventures at sea, he's shipwrecked at one of the Cyclades Islands, found by Heyday and her maid Zoe, who look after him in a cave on the beach. Heyday and Don Juan fall in love, despite neither speaking or understanding each other's language. But Heyday's father, Lambro, is a pirate and a slaver who has Don Juan enslaved and sent to Constantinople in the Ottoman Empire. Heyday dies of grief, so that's as a story. Now, George Vavasor, he's a totally different character. He's more clear-sighted, less impulsive than Burgo, and not prone to excessive drinking and dissipation. But he's a nastier person altogether. He's completely self-centered, with a sense of entitlement, which gives him a perpetual sense of grievance against everyone in the world. Whatever befalls him, it's somebody else's fault. His ambitions for success in the wine trade are thwarted because his grandfather unjustly refuses to raise the necessary money. John Gray has sinned against him by getting engaged to Alice. Alice, in turn, is his property and obliged to give him money for his electioneering expenses. His grandfather continues sinning against him by refusing to die so that he can inherit. And he'll stop at nothing. Dishonesty, threats, bullying, even violence. But next we come to another two characters I found extremely interesting. Alice Vavasor and Iphigenia Palliser form an unlikely alliance, and their negotiations are absolutely fascinating. They're both sensible women, conventional values, but ambitious in wanting a role that goes beyond marriage, children, and domestic duties. We already know Alice's views on the matter. As for the Mrs. Palliser, their idea of women, a snuffy president of foreign learned society, or some personally unknown lady employed on female immigration, was very much in their way. They belong to opposite camps, Alice to Lady Glencora's, Miss Palliser to the Palliser clan. Yet they have a common objective in preventing anything untoward happening at Monkshade between Lady Glen and Burgo when they're both there after Christmas. Their discussions are free and frank. They make no secret of their loyalties, opinions, and differing views on the parties involved, but you cannot fault their politeness and mutual civility. They finally agree that Lady Glencora should not go to Lady Monk's as planned, and Miss Palliser undertakes to do the necessary. They part amicably. And the next morning, when Alice is cold-shouldered by Plantagenet Palliser and his entourage, Miss Palliser is the only one who stands up for her from a sense of fair play and justice, which I find admirable. If only international negotiations could be conducted like that. Right. The next thing I find interesting, Burgo is offered a loan of £150 over 2 months for a total of £500 by the loan shark McGruin at Gray's Inn Lane. Now that is £350 interest for 2 months, which works out at 1,400%, but do check my calculation. Did that up when I got back late at night after my cruise. Okay, George Vavasor, when he goes to collect the money for Burgo, actually gets 122, he only gets £122, 10 shillings rather than 150 because it's Christmas Day. Beats Wonga Wonga. Bank rates in those days, bank base rates were about 4 to 5%, and they would lend for more reasonable charges, but only to their own clients who they know to be trustworthy. And we have another example. Alice plans to raise money for George from part of her income, and she expects that if she gives up £300 per annum, she should be able to raise £8,000, which suggests she's getting about 3.75% interest on her money. And bank rates and lending borrowing costs were generally stable over that period, which is why somebody could, with a certain amount of capital, live on the interest without depreciation. I wonder if any economic historians among you would like to comment on that. Now we come to electoral practices. I guess this novel was set after the first Reform Act of 1832 and before the second in 1867, because Lady Glencora mentions how the matching seat, electoral parliament seat, was lost after the reform, and Matching was one of the 2 pocket boroughs belonging to the Duke of Omnium, the other being Silverbridge in Barsetshire. Now, the 1832 Act did away with most, but not all, of the rotten boroughs, which are rural areas with a handful of voters, and pocket boroughs controlled by the local squire. It also extended the vote to any man owing a household worth £10 or more, so adding 217,000 voters to the electoral poll. It also redistributed parliamentary seats to urban areas so that London, Manchester, Birmingham, and such places were properly represented and got more seats. But still, there was still a lot of corruption till the later reforms came in. For example, buying of votes, influencing voters by free drinks and hospitality, as often mentioned in Victorian literature. George Vavasor has to pay for free drinks to all comers in Mr. Grimes' public house in Brompton Road. Scrooby talks of the previous MP spending £6,000 on the electors of Chelsea. And when Grimes goes over to the other side for the by-election, Scrooby estimates that he can take 150 votes with him. So there was still a lot of issues to be addressed there. And finally, I'll finish by saying a few words about the railway network then. Okay. We see people traveling everywhere by train in Victorian novels, and there seems to have been a fairly big network by then, mostly radiating out from London in all directions. So we hear about Westmoreland, between Lancaster and the Lake District, and Northumbria, where the Vavasor estate is, the Vavasor Manor. And then people go to Chelmsford, Cambridge, where Mr. John Gray lives, and then Mrs. Greenough traveling to Norfolk, Yarmouth, etc. The Pallisers go to Folkestone on their European, they travel to Folkestone, so let's have a quick look at how it all developed. The Liverpool-Manchester Railway opened in 1830 chiefly for goods and all steam-powered. And that's what led to a demand for passenger travel. So a number of railway companies started up covering different areas, ad hoc links between networks with little central planning. And there was interest from various different sources, investors, engineers, entrepreneurs, but little involvement from the government. Also some opposition from landowners, as you see in Elizabeth Gaskell's Cranford. And so it was not always possible to choose the optimal straight line routes. That's why the railways had to curve around so much, because it all depended on availability of land and the landowners, whether they were prepared to give up their land. And hills had to be avoided if possible. So sometimes you had to, again, go around them, because engines and insufficient horsepower could have a maximum speed of about 30 miles per hour. And some of those routes still exist. Then there was a controversy about the narrow gauge versus broad gauge, but narrow gauge finally won the day. Accidents were frequent, and that brought the government in to make regulatory laws, ensure standards, and fares and accommodation were also regulated, provision of low-cost third-class carriages for the poor. And the network developed very rapidly indeed. So, let's see. There you are. You can see that was in 1840. That's in 1850. So huge growth. You can see that. So just to run through a few of the developments, 1837, there was a London Euston to Birmingham service and a connection to the London Manchester Railway. 1838, the London South Western. 1839, London to Brighton and South Coast. Then 3940, York, connection to Hull, Scarborough, Harrogate. Then the Southeastern in 1842. Midland, 1844, Derby, Manchester, Birmingham and Carlisle, which meant we're getting closer to Northumbria, etc. Then the London Northwestern, Crewe, Chester, Liverpool, again from London Euston this time. Then 47, York, Newcastle, Berwick, so we're getting to Scotland now. And then 1859, somewhat later, London, Chatham, Dover, which was very useful for getting to France and the continent. 8,000 miles of track between 1840 and 1850. Makes you wonder why HS2 is taking so long. And until about 1870, all the stations were the mainline stations were around central London, Paddington, Euston, King's Cross, Charing Cross, etc. And then people had to take a carriage into the centre of London. And the Metropolitan Tube Network came in 1873 to solve that problem. So that this is what the network looks like today. And apart from rail strike, it is a very good thing indeed. Thank you.